Okay, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the next session on the GSHPA webinars. Today we have got Edward Thompson speaking to us on information about how heat pumps, what's stopping potentially heat pumps being rolled out more in the UK, generally because of the spark gap or the difference in price between gas and electricity prices. So this will be a really interesting discussion today. Plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. So just put any questions you've got into the chat function, and I'll be keeping an eye on those. And at the end, I'll be putting them to Edward to answer, hopefully. As usual, this is being recorded and will be on our YouTube channel, the Ground Source Heat Pump Association channel, afterwards. So if you are watching this afterwards and you've got any questions, please feel free to send them through to Edward, myself, or directly to the Ground Source Heat Pump Association. I think the email is at the end. So I think that's all the preamble. Edward works for ISACs UK. They are specialists in the development and design of large-scale heat pump systems, particularly connected to district heat networks. And they've done a lot of research projects with BAYES and Innovate UK. So they have a lot of experience, loads of case studies, a lot of interesting work going on for ISACs. So I'm going to let Edward introduce himself a little bit more as well. And then I think it's now 1:05, so I'm going to hand over to Edward, and you can take it away. Thanks, Edward.
Laura, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you also for setting up this webinar series, which has been very valuable, these Thursday GSHPA webinar series. Most of the webinars have been aimed at spreading good practice on ground source heat pumps, including examining critical issues like ground arrays for closed loop and open loop systems, and highlighting that there's a lot of experience within the GSHPA for members to draw on. These are key aims of the GSHPA, to spread good practice and high standards. Today's webinar is a little bit different because we're looking at another function of the GSHPA, which it performs for its members, which is lobbying, persuading and explaining what heat pumps and ground source heat pumps, ground source energy can do to help provide heat without combustion, without issuing any CO2 and without contributing to global warming. Some 9 or more months ago, just before the election, I attended a seminar at which Kwasi Kwarteng was speaking, the energy minister. He'd been invited to speak. I had a chance to speak to him before the meeting, and said that the very low price of gas in the UK was a fundamental barrier to progress in controlling carbon emissions here. I said that the rate of VAT for consumers in this country was 20% for nearly everything, except food and children's clothes. Did he know what the rate was for burning gas? He said no, but I think you're about to tell me. He was right. The answer is just 5%, and it's the lowest of any major country in Western Europe. That is why very few people are buying heat pumps. Only 18,000 heat pumps were sold in the UK in 2018, compared to over 100,000 in Sweden. More than 5 times as many heat pumps are sold in Sweden as in the UK. I asked him if he knew the population of Sweden. No, he said, but I think you're about to tell me. The answer is only 10 million, compared to the 68 million in the United Kingdom. Therefore, a Swede is 35 times more likely to buy a heat pump than a Brit. This is a key barrier to the introduction of heat pumps in this country. Sadly, at that point, we were all called into the seminar, and so the conversation broke up. However, almost everyone now recognises that we need to decarbonise heat in the UK. We need to decarbonise the UK, but most people seem curiously unsure of the way to do this. In electricity generation, huge strides have been made, with more than 50% reduction in grid carbon factor over the last 6 years. A further 50% reduction is expected over the next 6 years. In transport, it's clear that electrification of vehicles is the clear answer to lowering carbon emissions, and also emissions of NO2 and other noxious gases which exacerbate respiratory diseases like COVID. We then come to the decarbonisation of heat, which is the key problem, which is frequently described as by the oil lobby as difficult, because they would like it to be difficult and not addressed. In fact, there is a clear central practical route to the decarbonisation of heat in this country, and that is to use heat pumps, which use heat pumps for heat transfer instead of burning carbon compounds and releasing CO2. In effect, this serious fiscal imbalance is what is hindering the uptake of low carbon heating in the UK. So, what needs to be done to address this? Who needs to do what? The GSHPA is doing what it can by highlighting the barrier of the fiscal background at regular meetings with BEIS and with other trade and government bodies. If the government is serious about ever reaching net zero, then the multiple taxes and levies on electricity need to be removed by the Treasury. If we stop releasing CO2 from heating, it would be helpful if these taxes were imposed on fossil fuels. But let's have a look. Let's have a look at the actual background of the prices, of the fiscal background. Here we have on the right-hand side the price of gas in all large Western European countries. And you can see that the price of the top of the chart, the UK has almost the lowest price of gas in Europe. It's not quite as low as Belgium, but it's lower than other countries, and it's hugely lower than Sweden and Netherlands and Finland. This is the price of gas. And these charts, in fact, concern the industrial prices of energy rather than the domestic, although they're not very different. This chart, incidentally, comes from UK energy prices published by BEIS in 26th of March 2020, so they're recent numbers. If we look across at the electricity side, so where is the UK in electricity prices? The answer is it is right at the bottom, and it is the most expensive. It's more expensive for industrial users to buy electricity in the UK than any other country in Western Europe, apart from Italy, where it is more or less the same as it is here. So that is a factor of 3 pence for gas and 12 pence for electricity, which is a factor of 4 to 1, and ruins the possibility of selling heat pumps in the UK. But it's worth perhaps looking at this chart again, because we should also look at the real cost of gas and the real cost of electricity. If you look again on the right, you'll see there's a dark blue line, which is the real cost of gas, and then there's a light blue line, which is the taxes superimposed on top of the price. So you will see that the UK imposes a very small amount of tax on top of the gas. So it increases from approximately 3 pence a kilowatt hour to 3 pence a kilowatt hour. Unlike, say, Finland, where there's a considerable increase on top of the price of gas for taxes. By contrast to that, look again at the UK price. Look again what the Swedish price. It has no taxes, almost no taxes on electricity, but look at the UK. The real price of electricity in the UK is only 8 pence a kilowatt hour. The price paid is 12 because of taxes and levies and eco this and eco that and all sorts of things which are supposedly designed to convert us to decarbonising the UK. This is highly illogical. All these taxes should be on carbon emitting energy, such as gas, and none of them should be on electricity. The price of electricity is 4 times that of gas when you've taken in the taxes. However, if you take out the taxes, the ratio is just 8 pence to 3, and that's a difference of 2.5 rather than 4, and would make a radical difference to the price that people would have to pay for electricity. So that is a key barrier to the sale of heat pumps in this country. Now, it's noticeable that while the fiscal background of UK energy prices is something that used to be rarely mentioned, it was the elephant in the room. Nobody talked about it, and it didn't seem to come up in conversation. However, it is now coming up in conversation, even on some occasions when it's not actually brought up by the GSHPA. An example is the recent heat pump retrofit report, which was published last week by the Carbon Trust. This is a report commissioned by the GLA, which is very anxious to decarbonise, and it actually has boldly claimed that it wants London to be net zero carbon city by 2030, not 2050, but by 2030, and to have the best air quality of any major city in the world. There are 28 of the London boroughs, 28 of the 32 London boroughs have declared climate emergencies, and over half of those have committed to net zero by 2030. That's a big aim. It's a big ask. And of course, we'd like to help them to do so. But again, I don't think we will be able to do so until the Treasury adjusts the fiscal balance. It is, however, this heat pump retrofit in London is a very good report. It extends to 157 pages, but there is only one page which is devoted to rebalancing gas and energy taxation incentive to incentivize low carbon heating. So at last, the message is getting through that something needs to be done about the fiscal barriers. So the GLA is doing its stuff to reduce carbon emissions and reducing NO2. We're really looking to the Chancellor to do his stuff and to adjust the fiscal balance so that there is a chance of selling heat pumps. I like to tell my clients that heat pumps are very efficient. You can have a coefficient of performance of 4. You can have 4 kilowatts of heat for the cost of 1 kilowatt of electricity, which makes heat pumps very efficient and the obvious go-to choice for heating. Or at least they would be if there was an even price of electricity and gas. But why, despite this huge advantage, are there so few sales of heat pumps? The answer is quite simply that the 4-to-1 ratio of coefficient of performance is swamped by the 4-to-1 ratio of the price of electricity over the price of gas. I'd love to tell my clients that although it's expensive to install a heat pump, you can forget about it when it's installed because the running cost is lower. But the truth is, it isn't. And that is a key factor. So GLA is doing something about it. The Treasury needs to do something about it. And ISACS is doing its best to contribute to lower carbon emissions, its work. And in the heat pump retrofit report, there is a page there on work being done in Southwark by ISACS. And ISACS has been working with Southwark for some years, helping them analyse where their carbon contributions are and where they can change them. And as ISACS has recently been appointed to install retrofits in 3 community heating systems, 3 community district heating systems in Southwark. And these follow on from work that ISACS has done before, particularly at the research work for Innovate UK, installing the balanced energy network at London South Bank University, the first large-scale heat pump, 5th generation district heating system, retrofit district heating system in the UK, as far as I know. And it is also in the London Borough of Southwark. A key factor in the balanced energy network is the London aquifer. The London aquifer stretches over large parts of London, including large parts of Southwark. And it is down to the London aquifer that we are going for the heat exchange for these 3 London community housing estates. These housing estates are currently heated by gas boilers. This is a retrofit. These gas boilers have been in for some time, and they are, of course, churning out CO2 and NO2 and everything else that gas boilers do. So it is very difficult for small companies to get into big contracts, but the key elements in these retrofits in Southwark are ISAC's experience with balanced energy network, working over a period with Southwark, the London aquifer, the hydrogeology experience, because there is a lot to be known to assess whether, even if the London aquifer is there, you can access it from the site that you're on. And you may have seen the seminars last week, and good friends at BGS are extremely helpful. They have a very extensive database to help us judge whether the water will be there. And also they have excellent geologists to help us study whether the water will be there. However, at the end of the day, we don't know whether the water is definitely going to be there till we've drilled the holes, which is expensive, and tested them. Having tested them, of course, there are opportunities to improve the yield if it's not as large as we'd hoped for, including acidization to increase the size of the fissures next to the 2 boreholes, the abstraction borehole and the rejection borehole. We also have to work very closely with the Environment Agency, because they're the ones who allocate permission or otherwise for drilling down and plumbing into the London aquifer. It's useful to establish a good relationship with the Environment Agency, because if you do that, you will be able to get the permissions if you speak their language and answer their questions in the way that they're looking for them to be answered. Another key factor here is lowering the heat distribution temperatures in these community networks. Of course, we cannot change the heat distribution very far, because the aim is to refurbish these without refurbishing the buildings themselves and the heat distribution within the building. Another key factor to enable this to be possible is providing high temperature heat pumps, which can provide temperatures close to the temperatures that were previously provided by gas boilers. This, of course, is critical in order to install heat pumps without having to refurbish the buildings, which would be expensive, disruptive. A final thing which is critical are the heat pump controls in an integrated environment, because we have to organize the heat pumps. There's all sorts of things going on in the background, like demand response, but there's also coordinating between the existing gas boilers and the heat pumps, because of course people live in these buildings and there shouldn't be any interruption of heat in the changeover from gas to heat pumps. And indeed, there isn't a complete changeover, because the gas boilers will be retained. They will be retained partly because on the coldest days of winter, the heating from gas will be needed. And coordinating that, the controls are very important in coordinating that, feeding some heat from the gas boilers without allowing the gas boilers to take over. The one of these housing estates is called Newington, and it's predicted that over the first 25 years of life, 25,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent will be saved in Newington. The second one is called Wyndham, which is of similar size, and also that is predicted to save 26 or 27,000 tonnes of CO2 over its 25 years of life. Consort is a little bit smaller, so the CO2 saving will not be quite so large. But these are dramatic savings, and we are able to come forward and help Southwark in its plans for decarbonisation. We are using water source heat pumps, getting down to the London aquifer, understanding how it works, how it can be made to work, and using ISAC's high temperature heat pumps to get through and to get up to the temperatures which are required in order that refurbishment of the whole setup is not required. There are around 2,170 houses which are being refurbished in this way and will be provided across these three communities with low carbon heating, effectively zero carbon heating, if the electricity comes from green electricity. So I'm grateful for your attention. That is the summary I'm giving of the key barriers to having heat pumps, but also it's not depressing because there are opportunities to install heat pumps, and we are getting on and doing it.
Thank you, Edward. That was really good. Thank you so much for that. If anybody has any questions for Edward on this or on the case study that is just presented, please do put them into the chat box and I can put them over to Edward. Edward, just a couple of points from me really. You said there that there is some good news. It's obviously not all doom and gloom. So people like the jobs that you're doing at the moment in London, they're obviously still wanting to go ahead regardless of the price of gas and the price of electricity. What is driving that?
Right, that's an important question. And the answer is that the projects that we're doing for Southwark wouldn't have happened without the RHI, the Renewable Heat Incentive. There are the disincentive to introduce heat pumps in the UK is so strong that the government has introduced a set of incentives over the years to try and encourage people to decarbonise. One of these is the renewable heat incentive, but from the point of view of heat pumps, it has really been very unsuccessful indeed, because the number of if you can look in the report, the Carbon Trust report, the number of heat pumps that have been installed in London is very, 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 very small in spite of the renewable heat incentive. Most of the renewable heat incentive has gone on sponsoring biomass boilers, which issue CO2 far more than gas does. So I believe that the RHI has been misdirected. But in answer to your question, we wouldn't have been able to get through to Southwark, and we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing with them if it wasn't for the RHI. There's RHI in various, there've been various other sponsorships on a domestic scale. There've been the so-called Green Deal, which I think introduced 5 or 7 people to introduce a heat pump only, because whatever the government says, these sticking plasters like the RHI are really rather trivial. The central issue is the fiscal background. This is to do with the hidden hand of the market and to do with the capitalist system and how pricing is so important. When the price of gas is very, very low and the price of electricity is high, you can speak to somebody who may be green to his roots and he wants to have low carbon, but you explain to him it's actually going to cost him more because of the price of electricity. He says, well, I'd love to, but actually I can't afford it. So it is critical that the government does get round to doing the only thing which is sensible, which is adjusting the price of electricity and gas. Because There's talk at the moment about a follow-on from the RHI. I mean, the RHI has been hugely expensive to administer. It's administered by Ofgem. There have been a lot of illogicalities. There's a lot of asking for things like, have you got planning permission for ground source heat pumps? When everyone, including Ofgem, knows that you don't need planning permission, yet they get wrapped up in legal shenanigans saying we have to ask the question because we might be vulnerable if you paid out money and we hadn't got a bit of paper saying that you don't need planning permission for a heat pump, even though everyone knows that. We need to get past all this bureaucracy and all these sticking plasters and get to the root of the problem, which is the price of electricity and the price of gas. Sweden sells 35 times more heat pumps than the UK does. It's simply to do with the price of electricity and gas and the ratio and the difference between Sweden and England. It's not difficult.
Okay, could you comment on time of use tariffs and how that could help the cause, really?
Yes, time of use tariffs are critical, there's we're talking demand side response. Now, demand side response comes broadly in two ways. One is very complex, and one is really very simple. Let me deal with the simple one first. Although it has to some extent already been dealt with rather well by David Jones of Hafford in an earlier webinar in this series, maybe the second or third webinar, when what he was doing was using agile tariffs from, I think it was Octopus, but it may have been somebody else, and time of use tariffs where the price of electricity is low by night and high by day. You know in advance what it's going to be. If you have a building with a high thermal mass, at the time when the price of electricity is low, you can heat your building up to a certain base level, which means that you don't have to be putting on your heat pump between 4 and 7 in the afternoon when the electricity price is highest. And for that reason, in spite of the fact that the electricity price is 4 times the price of gas on a normal level, with the time of use tariffs, you can actually improve that. And Dave Jones showed that he was able to save money for his clients on a domestic scale. Now that is the simple way to do it, and it can be done quite simply by anybody. Let me talk now about the complex method of demand side response, which we have researched as part of our research programs. And this is very complex. This is to do with control systems for heat pumps, control systems linked in over the internet in real time to aggregators. And the aggregators do sometimes send you a message, which is of the form, could you use so many kilowatt hours of electricity over the next 2 hours if the price was only 1 pence a kilowatt hour. If you can respond to that, if you can get your computers to respond to that within 20 seconds and say yes, and then go on and do it, then you can have a kilowatt hour for that period. You might even be paid. And there's a whole very complex jargon about how this works. And that is the reason why it's beyond the scope of certainly domestic people. And that's why it's better to go through somebody like Octopus, who digests this complexity for you and gives you a simplified version of agile tariffs. But if you're very sophisticated and you have a very sophisticated control system, which has to take into account all sorts of things, because everyone knows that heat pumps aren't very efficient if they're clicked on and then clicked off 15 seconds later. So the computer algorithms have to say, here's this cheaper electricity. Do I need to turn my heat pump? And the heat pump has to be on for a quarter of an hour for it to make sense. So with the idiosyncrasies of a heat pump, is it sensible for me to respond to these calls for cheaper electricity in this time frame, in this way? And if you can get all that together, you're very, very clever. But if you can get all that together, you will have a much lower cost of electricity. And there are big opportunities for lower costs of electricity in this way in the future. There's been talk about this for some time, and there is a big potential for it, but I have actually yet to see it working very effectively, because although there's demand turn up and demand turn down, and there's no end of jargon all behind it, but I don't know of any heat pump companies which are sophisticated enough to have control mechanisms to benefit directly from demand side response without going through aggregators or without going through companies like Octopus, who are making a serious effort to reduce this to a simple and usable format.
I think it's
maybe a longer answer than expected, but
yes, I was just going to say, I think it's something we're going to see a lot more of. I'm
yes.
certainly working on a couple of jobs at the moment where time of use is extremely important. This is post RHI, so in the absence of an RHI type scheme, I think trying to utilise cheap electricity as much as possible and using thermal storage is going to be very important, and there's going to be some really interesting projects, I think, coming up based on
Yes,
that.
I agree, and you mentioned thermal storage, and that's also highly relevant. At the Balanced Energy Network, which we installed at London Southwark University, as well as the high temperature heat pumps, as well as the access to the London aquifer, as well as installing the heat pump, which was an above ground network. We didn't have to dig into the ground because it's an ambient temperature heat network, and therefore we didn't have expensive high insulated pipes. But as well as that, was a research project, we had large 10,000 litre thermal stores, large water tanks. And if you've got large water tanks, very large water tanks, you can, and the electricity price goes down at 3 o'clock in the morning, you can heat up your water tanks to the full extent. And then during the day, you can draw water from that, either for heating or for people washing their hands or for kitchens or whatever, and not run heat pumps during the day which is premium price electricity. So yes, the thermal store can come in the form of the thermal mass of the building itself, but it can also come in terms of large water storage tanks. However, you do have to get this in proportion, because if, for example, in the Southwark housing estates, if we were to use tanks of water to balance the thermal storage, to balance the day and night price of electricity and so on, to make a real and useful difference, they would have to be enormous. Mm-hmm. So we are not doing that, in fact, in the 3 Southwark projects.
Yeah. Okay, that's great, thank you. One last question. What do you see that needs to happen to dramatically change the fiscal balance and make us to be more like other European countries, where either the gap in the price between gas and electricity is smaller, or actually gas is more expensive than electricity? It's been like this for a very long time in the UK. So what would you like to see happen to enable that to switch?
Well, I think it's really all in the hands of Rishi Sunak. Mm-hmm. The price of, I mean, there are maybe historical reasons here. The UK used to have North Sea oil fields, used to have Scottish North Sea oil fields. And we did sell gas very cheaply to our population. The government spent money installing a gas network. So now and that is a sort of sunk cost, and it's still being used, but people aren't really being charged for the cost of the network. They're just being charged for the gas. There are 2 things which are very important. One is that the Chancellor needs to reduce the price of electricity, take the taxes off, just take the taxes and the levies and the eco this and that off the price of electricity. That that would be a benefit for heat pumps. It would also be a benefit for electric vehicles. The second thing he needs to do severely, is increase the price of gas. Now, if you increase the price of gas, there will be a whole set of people who will immediately give a knee-jerk reaction. They will start chanting. What they will start chanting is fuel poverty, fuel poverty, fuel poverty. We can't possibly do that. But you can, and you should. It is the worst possible solution to fuel poverty is to say, oh, these people are poor. We need to give them more gas, to burn even more gas, to issue more CO2 and make the problem even worse. That is not the answer. The answer, we should of course protect people who are in poverty, which should properly be called heat poverty, not fuel poverty. But there is no justification for keeping down the price of gas for everyone, including millionaires, just because there are people who are in heat poverty. It's acceptable for the Chancellor to have large taxes on road fuel tax, both for domestic cars and commercial vehicles. There's an enormous amount of tax on fuel. And there should be, because the Chancellor should be discouraging the burning of CO2, the burning of all carbon compounds which release CO2. The magic thing about a heat pump is it doesn't involve combustion. So it's all in the hands of the Chancellor. And the Chancellor may not be able to do something until there's a wider appreciation in the population of what needs to be done, which is why all of us need to speak to everybody and say, there is a problem here. There is a problem of the fiscal balance. There is a problem of the fiscal background. We need to adjust it if we're ever going to address net zero by 2050, let alone 2030.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Is there any other questions from anybody on the call today? If not, we can stop there. So thank you very much, Edward. That has been really, really interesting. As you said at the start, a lot of what we've focused on so far has been on quality and a lot of technical information about heat pump industry. So to hear more about the blockers and enablers of heat pumps within the UK industry is obviously, it's absolutely key to making sure that we get more heat pumps out there. So thank you very much. And again, as I said at the start, if anybody's watching on YouTube and has any questions or any comments, please do feel free. You can contact Edward through ISACs on the web. You can contact myself directly or directed to the Ground Source Heat Pump Association on the usual email address as well. So please do go ahead and put any questions to us. So Edward, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who has attended, and we will leave it there and hopefully see you next week. Bye.
Thank you.